Nobody notices this. And honestly, that's what makes it worse. You've heard about the Nephilim your whole life. Giants, fallen angels, a corrupted world before the flood. But there's something in that story that should have bothered you immediately. Where are the daughters? Because if these beings existed, then half of their existence is missing. Not hidden, not unclear, missing. And here's the part nobody wants to say out loud. Half the story isn't missing. It was never meant to be told. Think about that again. An entire category of beings, completely excluded, from a text that explains everything else in detail. That's not a mistake. That's a decision. You were told this story in a very specific way. Clean, simple, easy to accept. That there was a time, before everything you know, when the world wasn't just different, it was corrupted at its core. And at the center of that corruption were beings the Book of Enoch calls the Watchers. Not humans, not gods, something in between. Beings that were supposed to observe, not interfere. But according to the text, they didn't just watch, they crossed a line. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back. They came down. Not symbolically, not metaphorically, physically. They entered the world of men. And what happened next is where everything begins to break. Because they didn't just appear, they integrated. They took human women. Not one, not a few, many. And this wasn't presented as a romance. It wasn't framed as love, it was described as a transgression. So a violation of boundaries that were never meant to be crossed. This wasn't just interaction. This was interference with creation itself. And from that interference, something was born. Not fully human, not fully angelic. Something else, the Nephilim. And this is where the story becomes disturbing. Because these weren't just children. They were described as massive. Not just tall, not just strong, overwhelming. The kind of presence that changes an environment just by existing. They didn't grow like normal humans. They expanded rapidly, beyond what the world could sustain. And with that size came something else, a nature that didn't align with the world they were in. They were violent, not occasionally, not situationally, constantly. The text describes them as consuming everything. Animals, all resources, and eventually, even humans. Imagine that for a second. A world where something exists that doesn't just live alongside you, it consumes everything around it and keeps growing. That's not just a threat, that's a breakdown of order. And that's exactly how the story presents it. The earth wasn't just filled with sin, it was filled with corruption that couldn't be contained, and this is where most people stop thinking deeper. Because the story moves quickly to the conclusion. Judgment, the flood, a reset, a complete wipe. As if the problem was solved, as if everything that shouldn't have existed was erased. But here's what should bother you. Before the judgment, before the flood, before everything ends, the text takes its time. It explains how the Watchers came down, how they chose human women, how the Nephilim were born, how they behaved, how they corrupted everything. It gives you detail, clarity, structure. So much detail that you feel like you understand exactly what happened. And that's where the problem begins, because right when the story should continue, right when it should explain what happens next, it stops. Not gradually, not subtly, completely. Everything about them is described clearly, except one thing. what happens after they exist, as a people, as a continuation, as a lineage, because if they were real, then they weren't just an event, they were a population, and populations don't just appear and then vanish without explanation. They develop, they expand, they continue, which means there's a part of this story you were never given, and the deeper you think about it, the harder it becomes to ignore. Because if everything else was explained in detail, then the part that wasn't might be the most important part of all. Now this is where the story starts to break. Because up until this point and everything feels structured, it feels like something you can follow, a beginning, a middle, an outcome. But the moment you stop listening and start thinking, you run into a problem, a real one. Because if this was real, if this actually happened, then we're not talking about isolated events. We're not talking about a few strange beings that appeared and then disappeared. We're talking about something much bigger, a population. And populations don't behave like stories. They don't appear for dramatic effect and then vanish when the narrative is over. They follow rules, structure, continuity. And structure always reveals something important, because for any population to exist, it needs balance, not just numbers, not just presence, balance, which means there are roles, there is development, there is continuation, and most importantly, there is reproduction. And reproduction, it doesn't happen in one direction. It requires both sides, which leads to a conclusion that's almost too obvious. But somehow, it's never addressed. There were females, not optional, not theoretical, necessary, because without them, this isn't a population. It's an anomaly, a moment, something that appears but cannot continue. And that creates a contradiction, because everything about the Nephilim suggests scale, growth, expansion, influence, not something temporary, something that spread, and nothing spreads without structure. So if they existed at that scale, then the idea that there were no females doesn't just sound incomplete, it sounds impossible. And if it's impossible, then we're left with only two options. Either they existed and were never mentioned, or something about them was deliberately left out. And that's where this stops being a story and starts becoming a problem. Because now you're not just listening anymore, you're questioning. And once you start questioning this part, you can't unsee it, because every detail you were given only makes the missing part more obvious. And if that's true, then you weren't told the full story. Now, slow down, because this is the part most people rush past, not because it's complicated, but because it's too quiet, and silence, when everything else is detailed, is never accidental. Let's look at it clearly. The text gives you names of the Watchers, their actions, their decisions, their consequences. It describes the Nephilim, their size, their behavior, their impact on the world. It even explains the judgment that follows. Nothing is skipped, nothing is rushed, everything is accounted for. Except them. No names, no roles, no explanation, nothing, not one line, not one reference, not even a hint that they existed. And that's where this stops making sense. Because this isn't a vague story. This is a structured account, which means what's missing is missing on purpose. The text doesn't forget them, it avoids them. Think about that. Avoidance requires awareness. You can't avoid something you don't know exists, So for something to be completely excluded like this, it had to be recognized first, and then left out. Now ask yourself this: why would a text that explains everything else in detail completely skip something this fundamental? Not minimize it, not summarize it, skip it entirely. That's not normal. That's controlled. Because real omissions don't look like gaps. They look like clean narratives, stories that feel complete until you stop and think. And when you do, you realize something is missing, something important, something that should have been there from the beginning. And this is where it becomes uncomfortable, because now you're not just reading the story, you're noticing what it refuses to say. And once you notice that, you can't go back, because every detail that is explained makes the silence louder. It's not just quiet, it's precise, targeted, intentional, and that raises a possibility most people don't even consider. What if the silence isn't a gap? What if it's a boundary? Not something missing, but something that wasn't meant to be included, not forgotten, not removed, but never written, because it didn't fit within the rest of the explanation. Because silence like this isn't random, it's controlled. If this isn't bothering you yet, stay here, because it will. And if you already feel like something is off, subscribe now, because most people won't stay long enough to understand why. All right, let's not overcomplicate this. Let's run through the possibilities, quickly, cleanly, and honestly, because at this point you should already feel it. Something doesn't add up. So let's test the explanations people give. Maybe they were there, but they didn't matter. Maybe the text just focused on the violent ones, the males, the destruction, and ignored everything else. That doesn't make sense. You don't ignore half of a corrupted lineage, especially not in a text that goes into detail about everything else. Names, actions, consequences, everything is recorded except them. That's not selective storytelling, that's exclusion. And exclusion like that is never accidental. Now this one gets interesting. What if the Nephilim weren't a species, not a system, not something that followed natural rules, but an event, something that appeared, broke the structure, and didn't continue the way we expect, which would mean they weren't stable, they weren't balanced, they weren't designed to reproduce normally, and that would explain the absence, because maybe there was nothing to describe. But here's the problem. Everything else about them suggests scale, growth, expansion, influence, and none of that happens without continuation. So this explanation starts to fall apart. This is where people start reaching. You'll hear ideas like, maybe the females weren't like the males. Maybe they weren't giants. Maybe they were something else entirely. Some even go further, suggesting things like, maybe they were aquatic. Maybe they were hybrid in a different way. Maybe something like what we would call mermaids. And at first, that sounds mysterious, ancient, even possible. But here's the truth. That doesn't come from the text. That comes from mixing stories, different traditions, different mythologies, combined into something that feels ancient, but isn't. And the moment you step outside the source, you lose clarity, you stop investigating, and you start imagining. Now this one is different. Because this one doesn't try to explain what they were. It explains why they weren't included. What if they existed, but didn't fit the structure of the story being told? What if they didn't behave the same way, they didn't follow the same outcome, they didn't align with the explanation the text was building, and instead of forcing them into the narrative, they were left out completely? Not erased, not removed, just not written. Now look at all the possibilities again. Ignored? Doesn't hold? Not real? Doesn't align? Something else entirely? Not supported? Didn't fit the narrative? That's the only one that doesn't collapse under pressure. Because the most dangerous part of a story isn't what's explained, it's what doesn't fit and gets left out. And if they didn't fit the narrative, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What were they that made them impossible to include? This is where things start to drift. Not in the text, in people's interpretations, because once there's a gap, once something isn't explained, the human mind does what it always does. It fills it with ideas, with theories, with things that sound convincing, but don't actually come from the source. And suddenly, what was once a clear narrative starts to fragment. This is where truth starts getting replaced, not with lies, with assumptions. You'll hear things like, they were different. They weren't like the others. They were something else entirely. They weren't even human. And the more you hear it, the more it starts to feel real. Because repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity feels like truth. But here's the problem. None of that comes from the original account. None of it is stated. None of it is described. None of it is confirmed. It's added, built on top of silence. And once that happens, you're no longer reading the story. You're reading what people have layered onto it. And the moment you step outside the source, you lose control of what's real. Because now you're not investigating anymore. You're interpreting, and interpretation can take you anywhere. This is how confusion grows. Not all at once, but slowly. One idea at a time. One assumption layered over another, until the original question gets buried. And the most dangerous part, it doesn't feel like confusion. It feels like discovery. It feels like you're learning something deeper, when in reality, you're moving further away from the only thing that matters, what was actually said. Because confusion doesn't replace truth by force, it replaces it by feeling convincing. And once something feels convincing, you stop questioning it, you accept it, you repeat it, and eventually, you believe it. So let's bring this back to what we actually know, back to what's actually written. Because the moment you strip away everything added later, you're left with something much more unsettling. Not answers, not explanations, but a gap, a very specific gap. One that hasn't been filled because it was never explained in the first place. And once you remove the distractions, what remains is a question that becomes impossible to ignore. Why is that gap there at all? Now let's go deeper. Not into theories, not into interpretations, into something the text actually says. But most people never stop to process, because up until now, everything still feels contained. A past event, a finished story, something that happened and ended. But that assumption is where everything changes. Because when you read the Book of Enoch carefully, you'll notice a detail that most people move past too quickly. Not because it's hidden, but because it's uncomfortable. The text says, when the Nephilim died, their bodies were destroyed, but their spirits remained. They didn't disappear. They didn't return. They didn't end. They stayed. Let that sit for a second, because this is the part where the story stops being distant and starts becoming something else. They didn't end. They changed. Now think about what that actually means. Something that once had form, no longer does, but still exists, still present, still active, in a way that isn't visible. And this is where most people disconnect, because it's easier to accept they were destroyed than to accept they're still here in another form. Because if something changes form, it doesn't stop existing. It just becomes harder to recognize. Now take a step back. Everything you've heard so far, the Watchers, the Nephilim, the corruption, the destruction, all of it builds to one assumption, that the problem was removed, solved, finished. But this line changes that completely because it suggests something else, that what existed then didn't fully leave. It transitioned. And if it transitioned, then it continued, not in the same way, not in the same form, but in a way that doesn't require visibility, physical presence, recognition, which leads to a question that becomes impossible to ignore. If something like that exists, how would you even know? The most difficult things to understand aren't the ones you can't see. They're the ones that don't need to be seen, and that's where this becomes uncomfortable. Because now, you're no longer dealing with a story about the past. You're dealing with something that never fully ended. And if their bodies were destroyed, but their existence continued, then the question you can't avoid anymore is this: what did they become, and where are they now? They didn't disappear. That's the first thing you have to understand, because the way the story is usually told, it sounds like everything ended, that whatever existed back then was wiped out, removed, gone. But that's not what the text actually says. It says something much more unsettling. They became something else, not human, not angel, not something you can easily define, something in between. Something that no longer fits into the categories you're used to understanding. The text calls them unclean spirits, and that phrase is easy to read and move past. But stop for a second, because that's not just a label. That's a description of their state, what they are now, not what they were. Beings that don't have physical bodies no longer exist in visible form, but still remain present, still active, still interacting, just not in a way you can easily recognize. And that's where this becomes a problem, because something without a body doesn't mean something without presence. Think about that carefully. We tend to associate existence with what we can see, what we can touch, what we can prove physically. But this is describing something different, something that exists without needing any of that. And once you understand that, the entire story shifts, because now you're not dealing with something that ended. You're dealing with something that changed form and continued. Oh, and if it continued, then it didn't leave. It didn't move somewhere else. It didn't relocate to some distant place. It stayed. And here's the part most people don't sit with long enough. They're not described as being somewhere far away. They're not described as being removed from the world. They're not described as being inactive. They're described as remaining here. Not hidden in another realm. Not locked away somewhere unreachable. Here. Which means the question changes again. Not, did they exist? Not, what were they like? But, what does it mean for something like that to still be here? And that's where this becomes uncomfortable, because now you can't keep this at a distance. You can't treat it like ancient history anymore, because if something exists without being seen and still interacts with the world, then the only reason you don't notice it is because it doesn't need to be noticed. The most effective presence is the one you never realize is there. And once you understand that, you can't go back to thinking this story ended, because it didn't. It changed, and what it changed into didn't leave. And if they're still here, then the real question is no longer what they are. It's, what are they doing now? Now stop for a second. Don't just listen. Think. Because this is where the story stops being distant and starts becoming something you have to process. You're dealing with something that has no body, isn't visible, doesn't exist in a physical form. And yet, according to the text, it still exists. It still remains. It still interacts. Now ask yourself something simple. If something like that were real, how would you detect it? Not theoretically. Practically. In real life. How would you know? Would you see it? No. Would you hear it clearly? Not in a way you could prove. Would it announce itself? Of course not. So what would be left? Influence, not control, not possession. Influence, subtle, quiet, almost unnoticeable. Think about how influence works. It doesn't force, it suggests, it introduces, it nudges, and over time, it blends until it feels like it came from you. And that's where this becomes uncomfortable, because now you're not asking, is it real? You're asking, would I even know if it was happening? And the honest answer, you wouldn't. Not clearly, not directly, not in a way you could point to and say, that's it. Because something like this wouldn't operate in obvious ways. It wouldn't need to. The more obvious it is, the easier it is to reject. But something subtle, something that blends in, that's different, that stays. So instead of asking, where is it? The real question becomes, where would it operate without being noticed? And once you ask that, you start to realize something. This isn't about location, it's about access. Access to thoughts, reactions, patterns, decisions, not controlling everything, just influencing enough to shift direction. The most powerful influence isn't the one you can see, it's the one you believe is your own. And that's the real problem, because if something like that exists, then the only reason you wouldn't notice it is because it was never meant to be obvious. And if it was never meant to be obvious, then the question isn't, is it there? It's, how long has it been there without you realizing it? If this is starting to feel uncomfortable, stay here, because this is where most people stop thinking. Now step away from the story for a second, not the past. Right now, look at the world, not the headlines, the patterns, the way people think, the way people react, the way behavior can shift, almost overnight. You see it everywhere, sudden changes, ideas spreading faster than ever, groups of people moving in the same direction without ever meeting each other. reactions that feel automatic, responses that feel immediate, decisions that don't always seem fully thought through. And most of the time, we don't question it. We accept it. We move with it. We assume it's normal. But here's where you have to stop. Because once you understand what we just talked about, this starts to look different. What if not every thought starts with you? Let that sit. Not every action, not every decision, not every reaction, just not every thought. Because if influence exists, it doesn't need to take over everything. It only needs to introduce something small, a direction, an idea, a perspective, and then let everything else happen naturally. Think about how quickly something can spread today. A belief, a reaction, a mindset. It doesn't force its way in. It appears, it repeats, and then it becomes normal. Sen. And once something feels normal, you stop questioning it. Now take that idea and apply it carefully, not emotionally, logically. If something could influence without being seen, if it could operate without being detected, if it didn't need to control everything, just guide enough to shift direction, then what you would see is exactly what you're already seeing. Not chaos everywhere, not obvious disruption, but patterns, subtle alignment, gradual shifts. And this is where it becomes uncomfortable, because now you're not just looking at the world, you're recognizing something about how it moves, and the more you think about it, the harder it becomes to separate what started with you from what might have been introduced. The most effective influence doesn't interrupt your thinking. It becomes part of it, and once something becomes part of your thinking, you don't question it, you defend it, you repeat it, you act on it, without ever asking where it came from. And if something can operate like that, then the question isn't just about the world anymore, it becomes personal. Because if influence works at that level, then the next question is unavoidable. How close does it get before you notice it? Not by force. That's the first mistake people make. They imagine something obvious, something dramatic, something you would immediately recognize. But that wouldn't work, because anything obvious is easy to reject. Real influence doesn't force itself in, it blends in. It doesn't take control, it introduces. Small suggestions, nothing overwhelming, nothing extreme. Just enough to shift direction. Small thoughts, small reactions, small changes that don't feel important in the moment, but they don't happen once. They repeat, quietly, consistently, until they feel familiar. And once something feels familiar, you stop questioning it. And when you stop questioning something, it becomes part of how you think. And when it becomes part of how you think, it feels like you, not something external, not something introduced, you. That's how it works, not by overwhelming you, but by becoming indistinguishable from you. The most effective influence is the one you believe is your own. Let that sit, because if you believe something came from you, you don't question it. You trust it, you defend it, and once you defend something, it becomes part of your identity. And once something becomes part of your identity, you don't just believe it, you act on it, without ever asking where it started. That's what makes this different. It's not about control, it's about origin. Where did the thought begin? Where did the reaction come from? Where did the impulse start? Because if you never question the origin, you assume it was always yours. Not global, not theoretical, personal. because this is where it stops being a concept and starts becoming something you have to consider. Decisions you've made, reactions you've had, impulses that felt sudden, unexplained, immediate, moments where you acted, and only later asked yourself, why did I do that? Not everything, not every time, but enough to notice a pattern. Because influence doesn't need to be constant, it just needs to be effective. Small moments, small shifts, small decisions that change direction. And once direction changes, everything that follows feels natural. You don't question the path when it feels like you chose it. And that's where this becomes uncomfortable. Because now the question isn't, is this happening? It's, how many times has it already happened without you realizing it? The hardest thing to recognize isn't influence from the outside. It's the moment it starts to feel like it came from you. If you've made it this far, don't scroll, because this isn't just information anymore. Subscribe, or go to the comments and explain why you're okay ignoring something this serious. So, maybe they're not visible. Maybe they're not obvious. Maybe they don't need to be, because they don't need bodies to continue. They didn't need to be seen. They only needed to remain. Now everything changes, because at this point, you've seen the pattern. You've seen what's explained, you've seen what's missing, and you've seen what happens when the Nephilim die. Their bodies are destroyed, but their existence continues. So now the question isn't optional anymore. It's unavoidable. If the Nephilim didn't disappear, if they changed form, if they remained, then what about the part of them that was never explained? What about the daughters? Because if they existed physically, then they didn't just vanish. They followed an outcome, one way or another. So now you're left with two possibilities, and neither of them is comfortable. Did they become the same thing? Did they follow the same path? Transform into what the text calls unclean spirits? Or did something else happen? Something different? Something that didn't align with the rest of the explanation? And that's where the silence becomes heavier. Because now it's not just a missing detail, it's a missing outcome. And a missing outcome is far more dangerous than a missing description. Because description tells you what something was, outcome tells you what it became, and this was never given. Because here's the part most people won't even consider. Not because it's complicated, but because once you see it, you can't unsee it. What if they weren't excluded because they didn't exist? What if they were excluded because they didn't follow the same outcome? Think about that carefully. Everything in the text follows a pattern: cause, effect, action, consequence. The Watchers act, they are judged. The Nephilim exist, they are destroyed. Their spirits remain, clear, structured, explained. But the daughters, no cause, no description, no outcome. That's not incomplete, that's inconsistent. And inconsistency, in a structured account, usually points to something else. Not something missing, something excluded, because if they followed the same path, they would have been mentioned. If they became the same thing, they would have been explained. But they weren't, which leaves only one possibility. They didn't fit. Not into the pattern, not into the explanation, not into what the text was willing or able to describe. And that's why they were never included. Not forgotten, not removed, left out. Because the most unsettling part of any story isn't what's hidden, it's what doesn't belong and gets left out entirely. And once you see that, the story doesn't feel incomplete anymore. It feels controlled. And the part that was never explained becomes the part you can't stop thinking about. If you're still watching, you already feel it. This story isn't complete, so don't treat this like background noise. Subscribe, or go to the comments and explain why you're okay ignoring something this obvious. Because some things weren't removed from history, they were never written in the first place. In the next video, we will explore something even more mysterious, titled, "A Scientist Studied Jesus' Shroud for 40 years. One discovery broke him." I will link it immediately at the end of this video. See you in the next video. Good night and God bless you.